The autumn evening was getting darker by the minute as Amy Chan hurried home from her after-school job at the local diner. Her old Honda Civic hummed steadily as she drove through the familiar streets of her neighborhood, carefully following all traffic rules. She had promised her mom she'd be home before dinner, and she was cutting it close. The streets were quiet, with only a few cars passing by. The golden leaves rustled in the gentle breeze as Amy approached the four-way stop near her house. She came to a complete stop, just like she always did, checking all directions before proceeding. That's when she saw the flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Her heart started racing. In her 2 years of driving, she had never been pulled over. Amy guided her car to the side of the road, hands trembling slightly as she remembered everything her mom had taught her about dealing with police officers. Keep your hands visible, be polite, and stay calm. Officer Robert Wilson watched the small Honda pull over, already forming judgments in his mind. Another teenager who probably thought traffic laws didn't apply to them. He'd been having a rough day. His supervisor had criticized his recent performance reports, and his wife had been giving him the cold shoulder all week. He needed to show someone that he was still in charge. As he approached the car, he noticed Amy sitting perfectly still, both hands on the steering wheel, just like she'd been taught. Instead of appreciating her proper behavior, it somehow irritated him more. These kids and their perfect manners, probably thinking they could sweet-talk their way out of anything. License and registration, he barked, not even bothering with a greeting. His flashlight beam hit Amy's face directly, making her squint. "Yes, sir," Amy replied softly, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "My registration is in the glove compartment. May I reach for it?" Officer Wilson grunted in response, watching as she carefully retrieved her documents. Her hands were shaking slightly as she handed them over. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked, his tone harsh and accusatory. "No, sir, I don't," Amy answered truthfully. "I came to a complete stop at the sign and checked all directions before proceeding." Her response seemed to anger him further. "Are you saying I'm lying? I clearly saw you roll through that stop sign back there." Amy's eyes widened in confusion. I'm sorry, sir, but I'm certain I stopped completely. I always do, especially at that intersection." Officer Wilson's face hardened. "Step out of the vehicle," he commanded. Amy felt her stomach drop. The street was almost empty now, and the darkness was settling in. "May I ask why, sir?" "You don't get to ask questions here," Officer Wilson snapped. "I said step out of the vehicle. Now." With her heart pounding, Amy slowly unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out into the chilly evening air. She was wearing her diner uniform, a simple blue polo shirt and black pants, and the cold made her shiver. "Stand by the trunk," Officer Wilson ordered, following her with his flashlight beam. "You think just because you're some honor student," he said, glancing at her school parking permit, "you can talk back to an officer?" "No, sir, I wasn't trying to." "Quiet," he interrupted. "I've dealt with plenty of kids like you. Think you're above the law because mommy and daddy buy you nice things." He gestured at her well-maintained but clearly aging Honda. Amy felt tears forming in her eyes but fought to hold them back. "Sir, I bought this car myself with my diner job savings. And I really did stop at that sign." Officer Wilson pulled out his ticket book with a flourish. "That's it. I was going to let you off with a warning, but now you've earned yourself a ticket. And since you want to argue, I'm going to make sure it's a good one." He began writing, making a show of checking every possible violation he could add. Amy stood shivering by her trunk, watching other cars occasionally drive by. A few slowed down to look, but none stopped. She thought about calling her mom, but knew that could only make things worse. The sound of a security camera whirring above caught her attention. She glanced up at the convenience store across the street, its cameras positioned to cover the intersection. A small wave of relief washed over her. At least there was a record of what really happened. $350, Officer Wilson announced with satisfaction, thrusting the ticket toward her. "Maybe that will teach you to respect authority." Amy's throat tightened as she looked at the amount. That was more than 2 weeks' worth of her diner wages. "Sir, please, I can't afford this. I'm saving for college, and should have thought about that before you ran that stop sign and gave me attitude," he cut her off. "Now I'm going to run your information. Get back in your car and don't move. If you try to leave, I'll add evading an officer to your charges." Amy climbed back into her Honda, finally letting her tears fall silently as Officer Wilson returned to his patrol car. Through her rearview mirror, she could see him talking on his radio, taking his time, making her wait. The minutes ticked by slowly. 1 hour passed, then another. Amy's phone buzzed repeatedly with texts from her worried mother, but she was too afraid to pick it up while Officer Wilson was watching. The temperature dropped further, and her thin uniform offered little protection against the cold. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Officer Wilson returned to her window. "Next time, think twice before questioning an officer's judgment," he said, handing back her license and registration. "You have 30 days to pay the fine or appear in court. Now get out of here." Emmy's hands were shaking so badly she could barely put her car in gear. As she pulled away, she caught a glimpse of Officer Wilson in her mirror, watching her leave with a satisfied smirk on his face. The 5-minute drive home felt like hours. By the time Emmy pulled into her driveway, her mind was spinning with worries about how she would pay the fine, what her mom would say, and how unfair it all was. She had always believed that if you followed the rules and treated others with respect, everything would be okay. Today had taught her differently. As she walked toward her front door, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about a stop sign or a ticket. It was about power and how some people abused it simply because they could. What Emmy didn't know, as she wiped away her tears and prepared to face her mother, was that this incident would set in motion a chain of events that would change not just her life, but her entire community. Sometimes the smallest acts of injustice can spark the biggest changes, especially when they happen to the wrong person's daughter. Amy's hands were still shaking as she turned her key in the front door. The warm light from inside felt like a stark contrast to the cold treatment she'd just endured. Her mother, Linda, was waiting in the living room, worry etched across her face. One look at her daughter's tear-stained cheeks, and she was on her feet. "Honey, what happened? I've been texting you for hours." Linda rushed forward, pulling Amy into a tight hug. The familiar scent of her mom's coconut shampoo finally broke Amy's remaining composure, and she burst into fresh tears. I got pulled over," Amy managed between sobs, clutching the crumpled ticket in her hand. "But Mom, I swear I didn't do anything wrong. I stopped completely at the sign. I always do." Linda guided her daughter to their worn but comfortable couch, the same one they'd picked up at a yard sale 3 years ago when they'd first moved to this neighborhood. "Start from the beginning, sweetie. Tell me everything." As Annie recounted the evening's events, her mother's expression shifted from concern to anger. When she heard about Officer Wilson making her daughter stand in the cold for 2 hours, Linda's hands clenched into fists. $350? Linda whispered, looking at the ticket. That's ridiculous. Even if you had run the stop sign, which I know you didn't, that's an excessive fine." She pulled out her phone and started searching. "The standard fine in our county is only $90. Annie wiped her eyes with the tissue her mom handed her. "He added all these other things. He said I was argumentative, that I showed disrespect to an officer. But Mom, I was so polite. I did everything you taught me about dealing with police." Linda scrolled through her phone, her face growing more determined. "Tomorrow morning, I'm going to call the police department and file a formal complaint. This isn't right." "No, Mom, please don't." Amy grabbed her mother's arm. "Officer Wilson said if I caused any trouble, he'd make things worse. He knows where we live now. He has all my information." Linda's face softened as she saw the genuine fear in her daughter's eyes. "Oh, sweetheart, this is exactly why we need to report him. No officer should make anyone feel this afraid, especially not a teenager who was just trying to get home from work." Just then, Annie remembered something. The convenience store. "Mom, their security cameras were pointing right at the intersection. They must have recorded everything." Hope flickered across Linda's face, but it quickly dimmed. "Those cameras don't always work, and stores don't keep footage for long. We'd need to act fast." They spent the next hour making calls. The convenience store owner, Mr. Patel, answered despite the late hour. He listened to their story with growing concern. Yes, our cameras work very well," he said. "I had them upgraded last month after some vandalism. They capture everything at that intersection. Come by tomorrow morning. I'll help you get the footage before it's overwritten." That night, Annie barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Officer Wilson's smirking face and felt the cold air biting through her uniform. She heard phantom police sirens in the distance and jumped at every car that passed their house. The next morning, Amy and Linda arrived at the convenience store just as Mr. Patel was opening up. He ushered them inside, away from the early morning customers getting their coffee. "Look here," he said, pulling up the previous evening's footage on his computer. "We keep 7 days of recordings." The video was crystal clear. It showed Amy's Honda coming to a complete stop at the intersection, waiting the appropriate time, and then proceeding carefully. Minutes later, Officer Wilson's patrol car appeared, lights flashing. The cameras also record sound within a certain range, Mr. Patel added, typing on his keyboard. The audio wasn't perfect, but Officer Wilson's aggressive tone and Amy's respectful responses were clearly distinguishable. Linda's hands trembled as she watched her daughter being forced to stand in the cold. "Mr. Patel, is there any way we could get a copy of this?" "Of course," he nodded. "I'll save it to a USB drive for you." And he hesitated, then continued, "I've seen this officer do similar things before. Last week, he made a young man empty his entire grocery bag onto the sidewalk, claiming he was searching for stolen items. The boy had his receipt right in his hand." As Mr. Patel prepared the video file, more customers entered the store. A few of them overheard the conversation and began sharing their own stories about Officer Wilson. One elderly woman described how he had followed her home one night, claiming her tail light was out. When she checked later, it was working perfectly. "He picks on people he thinks won't fight back," said another customer, a college student who worked at the local bookstore. "People who can't afford lawyers or don't know their rights." Linda thanked Mr. Patel for his help and led Amy back to their car. They sat there for a moment, the USB drive containing the footage feeling heavy in Linda's hands. "What do we do now?" Amy asked quietly. "Even with the video, it's his word against mine. He's a police officer." Linda stared at the intersection where it had all happened, watching as morning traffic flowed smoothly through the stop sign. "I don't know, honey. But what I do know is that staying quiet won't help anyone. This isn't just about your ticket anymore. How many other people has he treated this way? How many more will he hurt if nobody stands up to him?" Amy thought about the stories she'd just heard in the store. She thought about the college students saving up for textbooks, the elderly woman driving home alone at night, the young man with his groceries scattered on the sidewalk. Each of them had felt the same fear and helplessness she had experienced. "Maybe," Amy said slowly, "maybe we should talk to Dad about this." Linda's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. She hadn't spoken to her ex-husband in months, and Amy rarely brought him up. But Linda knew that despite their differences, he had always wanted to protect their daughter. And right now, they needed all the help they could get. "You're right," Linda finally said. "I think it's time we gave your father a call." What Officer Wilson didn't know was that his cruel act against a seemingly defenseless teenager was about to expose years of misconduct and trigger changes that would reshape the entire police department. Sometimes the biggest waves start with the smallest ripples, and this ripple was about to become a tsunami. The decision to call Amy's father weighed heavily on Linda's mind as they drove home from the convenience store. She hadn't spoken to David Chen in months, not since their last awkward exchange about college tuition. Their divorce 5 years ago had been civil but distant, with David throwing himself into his legal career while Linda raised Amy on her own. "Are you sure about this, honey?" Linda asked, glancing at her daughter. "Once we involve your father—" "I know," Amy nodded, clutching the USB drive containing the security footage. "But Dad always said if I ever needed his help, really needed it, I should call." "I think this counts." Back home, Amy sat cross-legged on their living room floor, staring at her phone. Her father's contact information glowed on the screen. A number she rarely dialed, but had never deleted. Taking a deep breath, she pressed call. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "Amy, is everything okay?" The concern in his voice made her throat tight. "Dad, I need your help." As Amy recounted the previous evening's events, her father's breathing changed. She could picture him sitting in his office, probably wearing one of his perfectly pressed suits, his jaw tightening as she described Officer Wilson's behavior. "He made you stand in the cold for 2 hours." David's voice was controlled but carried an edge she rarely heard. "And you have video evidence of this?" "Yes, Mr. Punpal from the convenience store gave it to us this morning." "Dad, it's not just me. Other people in the neighborhood have stories about him too. He's been doing this for a while." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Emmy, what this officer did, it's not just unprofessional, it's abuse of power. But challenging a police officer isn't simple. Are you sure you want to pursue this?" Emmy looked at her mom, who had been listening quietly. "I have to, Dad. If not for me, then for the next person he decides to target. Someone who might not have security camera footage or a father who can help." "Send me the video file," David said after a moment. "I'll review it tonight and make some calls in the morning. And Amy, I'm proud of you for standing up for what's right." Those words, coming from her usually reserved father, brought fresh tears to Amy's eyes. After hanging up, she forwarded the video file and collapsed onto the couch, emotionally drained. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Andy called in sick to her diner shift, unable to face driving through that intersection again. Her manager, understanding the situation, gave her the next few days off to sort things out. That evening, as Amy and Linda were finishing a quiet dinner, David called back. His voice was different now, focused, determined. "I've reviewed the footage several times," he said, on speakerphone so both could hear. "What's particularly concerning is Officer Wilson's body language and tone. This wasn't a normal traffic stop, this was intimidation, pure and simple." "But will anyone care?" Amy asked, pushing her half-eaten dinner around her plate. "He's a police officer. Won't they just take his word over mine?" "Not this time," David replied. "I've made some preliminary inquiries. Officer Wilson has a history of complaints filed against him, but they've all been buried or dismissed. But none of those complainants had video evidence like we do." Linda leaned forward. "What are you suggesting, David?" "I'm suggesting we file a formal complaint, but not just with the local police department. We go to the County Oversight Board and the State Police Standards Commission. With the video evidence and the pattern of behavior from other witnesses, they'll have to investigate." "What about retaliation?" Linda voiced the fear that had been nagging at them. "He knows where we live." "That's exactly why we need to act," David said firmly. "If he retaliates in any way, it will only strengthen our case. And once the complaint is filed, he'll be under scrutiny. Any harassment will be noticed." As they discussed the details, Amy's phone buzzed with text messages from her friends at school. Word had gotten around about what happened, and more stories about Officer Wilson were emerging. A teammate from the volleyball team shared how he had made her walk home in the rain after impounding her car for a minor registration issue. Another friend's older brother had been threatened with arrest for looking suspicious while jogging in his own neighborhood. "Dad," Emmy interrupted the adults' conversation, "people are sending me more stories about Officer Wilson. Lots of them. Should I be collecting these?" "Yes," David replied immediately. "Document everything. Names, dates, locations. Each incident might seem small on its own, but together they show a pattern. This is bigger than just a traffic stop now." Later that night, unable to sleep, Emmy sat at her desk creating a digital document. She carefully recorded each story that had been shared with her, making sure to note every detail. As the list grew longer, she felt a mix of emotions: anger at the injustice, fear of what might come next, but also a growing sense of purpose. Her whole life, Emmy had tried to stay out of trouble, to keep her head down and just get through high school. But now she realized that sometimes staying quiet was the same as accepting wrong things as normal. Sometimes you had to stand up, even when it was scary, even when it meant facing someone more powerful than you. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Linda entered, carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate, their traditional comfort drink since Andy was little. "You should get some sleep," her mom said, setting 1 mug beside Amy's laptop. "Tomorrow's going to be a big day." Amy saved her document and took a sip of the warm drink. "Mom, do you think we're doing the right thing? What if it all backfires?" Linda sat on the edge of Amy's bed, cradling her own mug. "You know what my mother always told me? The right thing and the easy thing are rarely the same thing. We could stay quiet, pay the ticket, try to forget about it. That would be easier. But would it be right?" Amy thought about all the stories she'd collected tonight, All the people who had felt helpless and afraid because of one officer's cruelty. No, it wouldn't be right. Then we keep going, Linda said simply. Whatever happens, we face it together. And this time, your father's with us too. What none of them knew that night was that their decision to stand up against one officer's abuse of power would spark a chain reaction throughout the entire community. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't facing an enemy, it's simply refusing to stay silent in the face of wrong. What Officer Wilson didn't know when he decided to harass a teenager that cold evening was that David Chen wasn't just any lawyer, he was the newly appointed Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. He had kept his position quiet in their small community, preferring to maintain his privacy and that of his daughter. But now, seeing the evidence of police misconduct, he knew he couldn't stay in the shadows any longer. David sat in his chambers early the next morning, reviewing the security footage for the 10th time. Each viewing made his blood boil more, not just as a judge, but as a father. He had missed so much of Amy's life after the divorce, throwing himself into his career as a way to cope. Now, watching his daughter trembling in the cold while an officer abused his power, David felt the weight of all those absent years. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, minimizing the video window. His longtime colleague, Judge Patricia Rivera, entered with a concerned look. "David, I got your message. What's so urgent?" He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Pat, I need your perspective on something, not just as a judge, but as someone who used to work in internal affairs." As he played the footage for her, Patricia's expression darkened. When it finished, she sat back with a heavy sigh. "This officer clearly needs to be investigated, but David, you know you can't be directly involved. Not with your position." "I know," he nodded. "That's why I called you. I need to handle this the right way, through proper channels. But I also can't sit back and do nothing while officers like this abuse their power." Patricia pulled out a small notebook. "Tell me everything you know about this officer and any other complaints against him." For the next hour, they discussed the situation. David shared the growing collection of testimonies Amy had gathered from the community, while Patricia took detailed notes. "Here's what we can do," she finally said. "I still have contacts in the State Police Oversight Committee. We can initiate an independent investigation, one that can't be brushed aside by local department politics. But David," she paused, making sure she had his full attention. "Once this starts, there's no going back. Are you sure you want to take this path?" David looked at the frozen image of his daughter on his computer screen. "I'm sure, but not because she's my daughter. This needs to happen because it's right." Meanwhile, across town, Annie was surprised to find her story had sparked something unexpected at school. During lunch break, students gathered around her table, sharing their own experiences with Officer Wilson and other instances of police misconduct they'd witnessed. "He gave my brother a ticket for jaywalking," said her friend Tom from chemistry class. "At 3 p.m. on an empty street right after school let out. Made him late for his college interview." Lisa, a quiet girl from the debate team, spoke up next. "My grandmother, she's still afraid to drive at night after he followed her for 10 blocks, lights flashing, then just drove away laughing when she finally pulled over." As Amy listened to story after story, she realized this was bigger than her own experience. Each person who spoke had felt alone, powerless against a system that seemed designed to protect itself rather than the people it was meant to serve. That evening, when David called for their daily update, Amy shared what she'd learned at school. "Dad, it's not just a few incidents," she said, her voice stronger now. "He's been doing this for years, targeting people who he thinks can't fight back. But nobody ever reported it because they were scared, or they thought nothing would change." David's voice carried a mix of pride and determination. "Things are about to change, honey. I've set something in motion today, something that can't be ignored or swept under the rug." "What do you mean?" Amy asked, putting the phone on speaker so her mom could hear too. "The State Police Oversight Committee is launching an official investigation into Officer Wilson and the department's handling of previous complaints. They'll be reviewing body camera footage, patrol records, and interviewing community members. It's all being done independently, away from local influence." Linda spoke up from where she sat beside Amy. "David, what about retaliation? If Wilson figures out who started this?" "That's the beauty of how this is structured," David explained. The investigation isn't focused solely on Amy's incident. It's looking at years of potential misconduct. Multiple complaints will be investigated simultaneously. Wilson won't be able to target any single person. As they discussed the details, Amy felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. For the first time since that terrible traffic stop, she felt hope, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been afraid to speak up. Later that night, as Amy updated her document of collected testimonies, she received an unexpected email. It was from Mr. Patel at the convenience store, and attached were more security videos from the past month showing Officer Wilson's interactions with other community members. "I think these might help," Mr. Patel had written. "Sometimes the smallest people have the biggest impact when they're brave enough to take a stand." Amy forwarded the email to her father, then sat back in her chair, thinking about how one cruel act had set all this in motion. She thought about Officer Wilson, who probably believed he was untouchable, who never imagined that bullying a teenage girl would lead to his whole career being scrutinized. A text message from her father popped up on her phone. "Just reviewed Mr. Patel's footage. Amy, what you started here, it's going to make real change. Get some rest. Tomorrow's another big day." As she got ready for bed, Amy caught her reflection in the mirror. She looked different somehow, stronger, more determined. The scared girl who had stood shivering by her car seemed like a different person now. She had found her voice, and with it, she had helped others find theirs too. What Officer Wilson had failed to understand that night wasn't just who Amy's father was, it was that every person he had bullied and frightened over the years had been somebody's child, somebody's parent, somebody's friend. And now finally, all those somebodies were going to be heard. The State Police Oversight Committee worked quickly and quietly. Within a week of David's initial contact, investigators had set up a temporary office in a small building downtown, away from the police station. They called it a community outreach center, but its real purpose was to provide a safe space for people to share their experiences with Officer Wilson. The stories poured in like a flood breaking through a dam. The investigators, led by Senior Inspector Grace Thompson, had expected maybe a dozen complaints. Instead, they received over 50 detailed accounts in the first 3 days alone. "I've never seen anything quite like this," Inspector Thompson told David during their daily briefing. They sat in her temporary office, surrounded by stacks of testimonies and evidence files. "It's like the whole community was just waiting for someone to listen." David nodded, thinking of Amy's growing collection of stories from school. How many of these incidents were officially reported to the police department? "That's the interesting part," Grace replied, pulling out a thick folder. "Only 8 formal complaints were ever filed. But when we checked the department's records, we could only find 3 of them. The others seemed to have disappeared." The implications were clear. This went beyond one officer's bad behavior. Someone in the department had been actively covering up complaints against Officer Wilson. Meanwhile, Amy was discovering her own role in this unfolding story. What had started as her personal documentation of incidents had grown into something bigger. Students from other schools were reaching out through social media, sharing their own encounters with Officer Wilson. One afternoon, as Amy sat in the library during her free period, a freshman she didn't know approached her table. "Are you Amy?" the girl asked quietly. "The one collecting stories about Officer Wilson?" Amy nodded, gesturing for her to sit down. The girl, who introduced herself as Lily, twisted her hands nervously in her lap. "Last month, my grandfather had a medical emergency," Lily began. "He was driving me home from piano practice when he started feeling chest pains. I was trying to get him to the hospital, but Officer Wilson pulled us over for speeding." Amy's heart sank, already guessing where this was going. She pulled out her laptop, ready to document another story. "I tried to explain about my grandfather," Lily continued, her voice shaking. "He was getting worse by the minute, but Officer Wilson wouldn't listen. He kept saying we were making up excuses and took his time writing the ticket. By the time we got to the hospital," she paused, wiping her eyes. "Grandpa survived, but the doctors said those extra minutes could have made a difference." As Annie recorded Lily's story, adding it to her now extensive document, her phone buzzed with a text from her father. "Major development. Coming to see you and Mom tonight." That evening, David arrived at their house looking both exhausted and energized. He waited until they were all seated in the living room before sharing his news. The investigation has uncovered something significant, he began. Officer Wilson's dashcam and body camera footage from the past 3 years. Much of it is missing. The department claims there were technical issues, but Inspector Thompson's team found evidence that the footage was deliberately deleted. Linda leaned forward. What does that mean for the investigation? It means this is now much bigger than individual complaints, David explained. We're looking at potential systematic cover-ups within the department. The State Attorney General's office is getting involved. As they discussed the implications, Amy's phone kept lighting up with notifications. Word was spreading through student social media that something big was happening with the investigation. More people were coming forward, not just about Officer Wilson, but about other instances of police misconduct they'd witnessed. Dad, Amy said suddenly, people are asking me what's going to happen next. What should I tell them? David considered this carefully. Tell them to keep sharing their stories. Tell them that this time someone is listening. But most importantly, tell them to document everything. Every interaction, every detail matters now. Later that night, as Amy was getting ready for bed, she heard her parents talking in the kitchen. Their voices carried up the stairs, not arguing like in the old days, but working together, discussing ways to protect the community during the investigation. The Oversight Committee is providing protection for key witnesses, David was saying. And I've arranged for extra patrols from state police officers, ones we know aren't connected to Wilson or the local department. What about Amy? Linda asked, her voice tight with concern. Once this goes public, she'll be safe, David assured her. But more than that, she's shown remarkable strength through all this. Our daughter started something important here, Linda. Something that needed to happen. Amy sat on her bed, thinking about how much had changed in just a few weeks. The fear she'd felt during that traffic stop hadn't completely gone away, but it had transformed into something else, a determination to see this through, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless against injustice. Her phone lit up with another message, this one from Mr. Patel. More people came to check my security footage today. The investigators say it's helping build their case. You did good, kid. Amy smiled, remembering how scared she'd been to speak up at first. Now her voice had become part of a chorus, and that chorus was growing louder every day. What Officer Wilson had intended as an act of intimidation had instead become a catalyst for change. As she drifted off to sleep, Amy thought about Lily's grandfather, about Tom's brother missing his college interview, about all the people who had been afraid to drive at night or walk alone in their own neighborhoods. Tomorrow would bring more stories, more evidence, more steps toward justice. But for now, she could rest knowing that sometimes the smallest act of standing up for what's right could spark something much bigger than yourself. The morning everything changed started like any other. Officer Wilson pulled into the police station parking lot, confident in his routine. He'd been hearing whispers about some investigation, but he wasn't worried. He'd weathered complaints before. They'd always disappeared, thanks to his friends in the department. But today was different. As he walked through the station doors, he noticed the unusual silence. His fellow officers avoided eye contact. Before he could reach his desk, the chief of police called him into the office. Inside, Wilson found not just the chief, but also 2 state investigators and a representative from the Attorney General's office. The smirk he usually wore faded as he saw the stack of files on the desk. Meanwhile, across town, Amy sat in her first period class, trying to focus on her chemistry homework. Her phone buzzed quietly in her pocket. A message from her father. It's happening. Stay in school. Everything's okay. The news spread through the community like wildfire. Local news vans parked outside the police station. Social media exploded with updates from people who worked nearby. By lunchtime, everyone knew. Officer Wilson had been suspended pending investigation, along with 3 other officers suspected of helping cover up complaints. Amy's friends gathered around her usual lunch table, sharing what they'd heard. My mom works at City Hall, Tom whispered. She said they found hundreds of deleted body camera videos, not just from Wilson, but from other officers too. Lisa added, my uncle's a dispatcher. He said Wilson totally lost it when they told him about the suspension, started yelling about how they couldn't do this to him, how he had dirt on everyone. Amy listened quietly, thinking about how this one moment would change so many lives. Her phone kept buzzing with messages from people whose stories she'd collected, all sharing their relief and gratitude. After school, Emmy found her mother waiting in the parking lot instead of walking home as usual. Linda looked both excited and nervous. "Your father called," she explained as Emmy got in the car. "The Oversight Committee wants to meet with us. They're ready to share their findings." They drove to the temporary office downtown where Inspector Thompson waited for them. David was already there, looking more like Emmy's dad than the Chief Justice in his slightly rumpled suit. "Thank you for coming," Inspector Thompson began, once they were all seated. "What we've uncovered goes far beyond Officer Wilson's individual actions. We've found evidence of a systematic problem within the department." She spread out documents on the table before them. Over the past 5 years, Officer Wilson had accumulated 78 complaints. Only 3 were officially recorded. The others were deliberately buried or deleted. But what's more concerning is why. David leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "Wilson was being protected because he was useful to certain higher-ups in the department. He would target vulnerable people, teenagers, elderly drivers, immigrants, and write excessive tickets. This helped meet unofficial quota requirements and generated revenue for the department. In exchange, his behavior was overlooked." Annie felt sick to her stomach. "So all those people he hurt, it was for money?" "Partly," Inspector Thompson nodded grimly, "but it was also about power. The culture in the department had become toxic. Officers who tried to report problems were silenced or transferred. Those who played along were rewarded." Linda reached for Amy's hand. "What happens now?" "The Attorney General's office is taking over the investigation. Wilson and the officers who helped cover up his actions will face disciplinary hearings. But more importantly, the entire department will undergo a major reform." David shifted in his chair. "The community needs to know about this, not just what went wrong, but how it's being fixed." Inspector Thompson smiled. "That's actually why we wanted to meet with Emmy specifically. Your documentation of community stories, combined with Mr. Patel's security footage, broke this case open. We'd like you to be part of the community oversight board we're establishing." Andy blinked in surprise. "Me? But I'm just a student." "You're the one who showed everyone that speaking up matters," Inspector Thompson replied. "Sometimes the youngest voices are the ones we need to hear most." As they left the meeting, Amy's phone lit up with a news alert. The story had broken publicly. Officer Wilson's suspension was front-page news, along with the broader investigation into departmental misconduct. They stopped at their favorite diner for dinner, the same one where Emmy worked part-time. The usual customers gathered around the TV mounted in the corner, watching the news coverage. Mr. Patel was there too, nodding in satisfaction as the reporter mentioned the security camera footage that helped break the case. "You know what this means?" Linda said softly to Emmy. "No more families will have to go through what we did. No more scared teenagers standing in the cold. No more elderly people afraid to drive at night." David, who had joined them for dinner, something that hadn't happened in years, added, "And it's not just about punishing bad behavior. This is about making things better, about creating a police department that actually serves and protects everyone in the community." Emmy looked around the diner at all the familiar faces, people who had shared their stories, people who had been afraid but found the courage to speak up. She thought about Lily's grandfather, about Tom's brother, about all the others who had suffered in silence. "Dad," she said suddenly, "remember when you told me that sometimes the right thing isn't the easy thing?" He nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "I think I finally understand what that means. It's not just about standing up for yourself. It's about standing up for everyone who can't." As they ate dinner together, their first real family meal in years, Emmy realized that Officer Wilson's cruel act hadn't just exposed corruption in the police department. It had also helped heal her own family, brought her community together, and shown her what she was capable of when she refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. What started as one terrifying traffic stop had become something much bigger. Reminder that change is possible, that justice can prevail, and that even the smallest voice can make the biggest difference when it speaks the truth. 1 year later, Emmy stood at a podium in the community center, looking out at a room full of familiar faces. The newly formed Citizens Advisory Board was holding its first public meeting, and as its youngest member, Emmy had been asked to speak about the changes in their community. "A year ago," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves, "I was just a high school student trying to get home from work. I never imagined that one traffic stop would change not just my life, but our entire community. But that's the thing about standing up for what's right. You never know how far those ripples will spread." The changes in their town over the past year had been remarkable. After Officer Wilson's suspension and subsequent termination, along with the other officers involved in the cover-up, the police department had undergone a complete transformation. The new chief, a veteran officer known for her integrity, had implemented sweeping reforms. In the audience, Emmy could see Mr. Patel nodding along with her words. His convenience store had become something of a local landmark. People called his security cameras the cameras that changed everything. He'd even put up a small plaque explaining their role in exposing police misconduct. "Today," Emmy continued, "our police department has body cameras that can't be turned off or deleted. Every complaint is investigated by an independent board. Officers receive additional training in community relations and de-escalation techniques. But most importantly, people in our community are no longer afraid to speak up when they see something wrong." She glanced at her parents, sitting side by side in the front row. The past year had changed them too. Her father had stepped back from some of his Supreme Court duties to spend more time with family and oversee the police reform initiative. Her mother had started a support group for families dealing with law enforcement issues. Somewhere along the way, they had remembered how to be a family again. After the meeting, people gathered in small groups, sharing stories and updates. Lily was there with her grandfather, who had made a full recovery and now volunteered as a senior citizen liaison to the police department. Tom's brother had gotten into his dream college, and Lisa's grandmother was back to teaching her evening art classes, no longer afraid to drive at night. "You know what the best part is?" Tom said as their group of friends sat at their favorite diner later that evening. "The new officers actually know people in the community. Yesterday, I saw Officer Chen, no relation to Emmy," he grinned, "helping Mrs. Rodriguez carry her groceries up the stairs. No big deal, just being a good neighbor." Lisa added, "And remember last week when they caught those guys breaking into cars? Instead of just arresting them, they worked with the youth center to get them into job training programs. It's like they'd finally understand that protecting the community means more than just writing tickets." Emmy listened to her friends, thinking about how much had changed. The old fear that used to hang over certain neighborhoods was gone. People walked more freely, drove more confidently, lived more fully. The police were becoming what they should have been all along, partners in keeping the community safe. Her phone buzzed with a message from Inspector Thompson, who had become a mentor over the past year. "Just heard from another precinct. They want to implement our reform model. Your story is still creating change." That evening, Emmy sat at her desk, updating the journal she'd been keeping since everything began. What had started as a document collecting complaints had evolved into something more. A record of how one community had found its voice and used it to create real change. She thought about Officer Wilson, who had eventually faced consequences for his actions. But more importantly, she thought about all the future officers who would serve their community differently because of what had happened here. The next day at school, a freshman stopped her in the hallway. "Is it true?" the girl asked. "Are you the one who started all the changes with the police department?" Emmy smiled, remembering how scared and alone she had felt that night by her car. "No," she replied. "I just told my story. We all did. That's what started the change." Later that week, Emmy attended her first college interview. When the admissions officer asked about her most significant life experience, she didn't hesitate. "I learned that justice isn't just something that happens in courtrooms," she explained. "It happens when ordinary people refuse to accept wrong things as normal. It happens when we stand together and speak up for what's right." As she drove home from the interview, Emmy stopped at the intersection where everything had started. The stop sign was still there, but now it represented something different, not a place of fear, but a reminder that sometimes the worst moments in our lives can lead to the most important changes. She thought about the message she'd received that morning from a police academy recruit who had read about their community's transformation. "Your story made me want to become the kind of officer people trust, not fear. Thank you for showing us a better way." What Officer Wilson never understood was that true power doesn't come from making people afraid. It comes from helping them feel safe, from serving your community with honor, from doing what's right even when no one is watching. His cruel act had backfired in the most meaningful way possible. It had shown an entire community the power of their own voices. And somewhere in that community, another young person was learning the same lesson Emmy had learned, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply tell your truth and trust that others will stand with you when you do.